Outer Space Treaty and its development and where we stand now with it and possibly where we might go with it in the future. Um, just to recap, there are 5 United Nations treaties and principles on outer space. Um, this conference is, of course, on the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. There's 114 states parties to that now. You can see our treaty booklet is here, and that's, of course, the link down below. You can see that on our webpage and download that booklet. It has all of these instruments in it, as well as some others that I'll be going through as well. Of course, the Rescue and Return Agreement in 1968 came shortly thereafter, the Liability Convention, the Registration Convention, and of course the Moon Agreement. It encapsulates, of course, a lot of these issues that came at the very dawn of the space age. And I would like to really focus quite closely on the declaration of legal principles governing the activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space, the 1963 declaration, because this really was the very genesis of it all, the very lead up to all of the issues that have found their way into the Outer Space Treaty, have come and they stem from the declaration. And so we will just begin here in 1957. Soviet Union launches the first satellite, Sputnik 1, on October 4th. Then in 1958, the Soviet Union and the United States both request the General Assembly of the United Nations at the 13th session to consider various aspects of the peaceful use of outer space. And then the item is included on the agenda, the question of the peaceful uses of outer space. Later on December of that year in 1958, the establishment of the Ad Hoc Committee for the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. This is the precursor to the Committee for the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. And the GA requests that ad hoc committee to report on the nature of legal problems, among other things, which may arise out of the carrying out of programs to explore outer space. And so, over that course of the year, the ad hoc committee met and set up the legal subcommittee. And the legal subcommittee met 5 times in 1959 and discussed numerous ideas and issues in identifying legal problems, but gave priority to 6 legal problems. And we will see these 6 here now. So in 1959, the ad hoc committee set up a legal subcommittee. 6 problems were identified. And this is an interesting historical background to where we came into the Outer Space Treaty. And so one of those legal problems was the consideration of whether there was a general rule through the practice of states in their satellite programs, and that within that context of strictly peaceful uses, outer space is freely available for exploration and use by all, in accordance with existing or future international law or agreements. And so this is the genesis of this basic principles idea. And this idea also of this context of strictly peaceful purposes, could we consider that space activities were inherently legal from the very start, if they were for peaceful purposes and in accordance with international law? Okay. This is a major turning point in our story and where we start heading. Other problems that were identified by the ad hoc committee, the legal subcommittee of the ad hoc in 1959 over the course of that year, problem of liability for injury or damage caused by space vehicles, allocation of radio frequencies, the avoidance of interference between space vehicles and aircraft, the identification and registration of space vehicles and the coordination of launchings, and problems associated with re-entry and landing of space vehicles. So we see that even at this very beginning, these problems were identified that needed to be addressed. Was this inherently illegal activity if conducted for peaceful purposes? What about liability? What about interference of radio frequencies? How do we deal with the identification, registration of vehicles, space vehicles, coordinate launchings, and also the rescue and return aspects, the re-entry and landing of space vehicles? So this, in 1959, led to a General Assembly resolution establishing the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space to fully, more in-depth look at these matters. In 1960, COPUS did not meet. In 1961, the GA included the agenda item on their agenda, the report on the Committee of the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And in November of that year of 1961, COPUS held its first meeting and reported to the first committee. And of course, this was under the chairmanship of Manfred Lachs, the father of space law. And we will see how he played a role, as I will mention a number of ways that as we go through my presentation here. And so in that year, in December of 1961, after COPUS had met, the GA passed Resolution 1721. And this is an interesting phrasing in this 1721, this resolution, where it commended states for guidance in the exploration and use of outer space. So it commended their way in which they were handling this, and that the exploration and use of outer space was for those states. It was going to be handled in a way that was suitable for those states. They were providing guidance on how they were conducting their space activities, and they were to be conducting under the following principles. International law, including the United Nations Charter, applies to outer space and celestial bodies, and outer space and celestial bodies are free for exploration and use by all states in accordance with international law and are not subject to national appropriation. So this is at the very beginning of the resolutions that come on outer space. 1961 1721 resolution lays out that international law applies to outer space and that outer space is free for exploration and use by all states in accordance with international law and not subject to appropriation. And we will see these features play out in subsequent instruments as we go along. So then 1721 also requests the committee to meet in 1962 to study more legal problems and the exploration and use of outer space. And of course, the seminal 1721B part of this resolution calls upon states launching space objects into orbit or beyond to furnish information promptly to the committee through the Secretary General of the United Nations for registration of launchings, and requests the Secretary General to maintain a public registry and support the exchange of information. This resolution is still used today. We here in the Office for Outer Space Affairs receive registration information from states, not parties to the registration convention, but that file information under Resolution 1721B of 1961 for inclusion into the public registry, and we make those that registry public through our website, and we have an online searchable index that we have developed over the years. And so this is still very relevant, and we can see how these aspects of this 1721 resolution have been implemented and play out into later instruments, and we will see the building up of these later instruments. So in 1962, of course, in the early part of 1962, COPUS held meetings, and it established the two subcommittees, the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee and the Legal Subcommittee. And the first session of the Legal Subcommittee, chaired by Manfred Lachs, was held from May to June in 1962. And we saw two proposals come through from the United States and a proposal from the Soviet Union. And what did these proposals contain, and how are they related to this work in the ad hoc committee and this identification of legal problems? Well, let's start with the 1962 Soviet Union proposal. And this was in response essentially to the basic principles problem identified in the ad hoc committee. So they proposed 9 points that exploration and use of outer space be carried out for the benefit and in the interest of whole mankind. free exploration and use by all states would be enshrined. No state may claim sovereignty over outer space or celestial bodies. All states have equal right to explore and use outer space. And the activities of the conquest of outer space, let's say, must be done in accordance with the United Nations Charter and international law. There would be a emphasis placed upon international cooperation and of states, and some language that created some issues a little bit on use of outer space for propagating war, national racial hatred, these kinds of things. We will see how those ideas played as well. And then continuing on, the interesting part about the Soviet proposal was that cooperation mutual assistance would be a duty incumbent on all states, of a requirement to engage in international cooperation mutual assistance. And that activities pertaining to the exploration use shall be carried out solely and exclusively by states. This is an interesting position of the Soviet Union at the time. And then of the sovereign right of states to their objects and shall be retained by them. This language we will see come through in the Outer Space Treaty, in the ownership of objects launched into outer space. The use of artificial satellites would be for collection of intelligence information is incompatible with the objectives of mankind. This is an interesting way that we can see remote sensing principles come later on, much later after this, have a flavor of this, let's say. And finally, states shall regard astronauts as envoys of mankind and render all possible assistance. So these are these 9 points of the Soviet Union's proposal. And of course, there were some issues of language and a bit of a political flavor that could not be agreed on necessarily. But let's look at the United States proposal. Was really related to liability for damage and assistance in return of personnel and vehicles. Of course, liability that was proposed by the United States would be absolute, and that requiring proof of negligence would likely operate as a bar to recovery. This is an interesting way of looking at, of course, liability, and that it would attach for damage on land, sea, and in the air. On the assistance and return of personnel and space vehicles, we see that these two proposals would find their way into entirely new instruments, while they find their way, of course, into the Declaration and into the Outer Space Treaty. It was considered, even at this time, that the complexities of liability and the particularities of assistance and return would require their own instruments. And so, due to well, as we can predict, sometimes in our committees, there was no consensus on certain matters regarding the Soviet Union proposal. With the phrasing and the basic principles, there were complexities in of the liability and questions of establishing a working group or a panel of experts, which is, of course, familiar to our work in the legal subcommittee, even to this day. Sometimes these take a bit of working out and are a bit difficult, and I'm sure no one is surprised even that it was at that time difficult. And of course, it was considered that assistance in return was seen as a priority. Assistance to astronaut and return of space objects, it was seen as a priority. But again, whether it should be a separate document, how it could be incorporated into a basic principles document was a question. In 1962, the General Assembly met, of course, and expressed regret that there was no consensus on the output, let's say, of this year. Requested the legal subcommittee to urgently continue and elaborate an agreement that would cover the basic principles, liability, and assistance in return. So with that driven mandate, 1963, the legal subcommittee meetings in the second session under the chairmanship of Manfred Lax again, agreement was made on a compromise language where there was consensus. Consensus was formed on numerous points. Those ones that were not formed find their way in other places, continued discussions, and we have overall ideas on the basic principles. We have a term on liability. We have a term on assistance and return. And those complexities and practicalities of liability and assistance and return would be further elaborated in other documents and continue to be discussed. The 1963 Declaration of Legal Principles had a landmark features of where instead of activities being conducted only by states, as the Soviet Union had proposed, that national activities would include those of non-governmental entities, and that there would be authorization and continuing supervision by the appropriate party, by the appropriate state to those activities. So this paved the way for the entry of private sector activities in space activities. Also, the four-state launching notion was found its way into the Declaration of Legal Principles. That the state launching, or from the territory, or from procuring, or from the territory or facility of the state. Those would be a launching state possibilities. And so 1963 agreed on the Declaration of Legal Principles governing the activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space. And you can see these the declaration in full in our treaty booklet. After that debate, after that landmark declaration, the legal subcommittee debated in the 1964 and 1965 on, again, those complexities of liability. There was no consensus on whether a binding agreement embodying those basic principles should be given. But then in 1965, the General Assembly urged the committee to give consideration to incorporating an international agreement in the future as appropriate, the legal principles governing the activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space. So this was mandated, this was urged by the committee to give legal weight, make a binding legal agreement in 1965. And then in 1966, the committee, legal subcommittee, resolved all of those differences, and COPUS presented the draft treaty backed by 43 states. This was, of course, the landmark treaty on the principles governing the activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. In 1966, this was agreed by the General Assembly. It was open for signature January of 1967 and entered into force in the later part of 1967. And so we see the speed at which the international community came to agreement on what were these basic principles, how to handle various aspects of liability, how to handle the rescue and return issues. And they all stemmed from the very beginning of the ad hoc committee on the peaceful use of outer space, the development into the 1721 resolution, incorporating that outer space would be free for exploration and use in accordance with international law, principle of no sovereignty, then developed further in the proposals of the Russian Federation, or the Soviet Union at the time, and the United States to cover these issues. In the feeling in the mid-60s of this, of a period of slight, I would say, détente, as later Vladimir Kopal would call it, in the Cold War. Time was ripe to solidify these into an actual treaty, more than a declaration. And therefore, we get in 1966 the treaty, the adoption of the treaty, and then open for signature going into force the next year. This was an incredibly fast movement, and I think everybody that watches or as part of our committee, including all of the former chairs that we have speaking at this conference these next 3 days, would agree that this was an incredibly fast movement, one that is could we see this again? Only if the will is there from the states, from states members of the United Nations, as well as states members of the committee. So we go to, what does the Outer Space Treaty contain? It has all of those features, benefits and interests of the countries. We'll have here speakers on this today. The free exploration and use under Article 1. Principle of non-appropriation, we will hear on this from a couple of speakers later today. This is very interesting in the context of our current work. Of course, international law and the United Nations Charter applies. We will hear more on this as well. Prohibition of the station of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction under Article 4. Recognition of the envoys of mankind and information on dangerous phenomena. We will hear more about this as well. International responsibility for national activities under Article 6, the enshrinement for non-governmental entities and authorization, continuing supervision. We will hear more on this as well. International liability for damage, jurisdiction and control, cooperation, mutual assistance, due regard, harmful contamination, harmful interference, and a consultation mechanism under the amazingly complex Article 9. We will hear a lot about this as well. Information and notification. This is incredibly important. Of course, Article 10 on the viewing of launches of other states as well. We will hear installations on the moon on the basis of reciprocity. This is forward-looking, and we will hear how this might go down in practice. So these are these features of the Outer Space Treaty. We see these coming from the very first identification of those issues under the ad hoc Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, a charge and a march right through the Declaration on Legal Principles, finding their way in the Outer Space Treaty. We have activities today that fit in all of these areas, and we will hear speakers talk about these, each one of these articles. That's why I wanted to arrange this entire conference in this way, so that we would hear these various different perspectives on all of these different activities that fall within the Outer Space Treaty in this kind of way, because this is still relevant to all the work that we're doing. And we see this as the progressive development of space law. We see these elaboration of these treaties were already of these identified areas. As I mentioned, Rescue and Return Agreement, 1968, Liability Convention, the Registration Convention, all had their root in the Declaration, in those very first ideas. And that was, of course, to find a way to ensure that through those basic principles that space activities would be considered a legal activity done for peaceful purposes and in accordance with international law. These was the treaty-making era into the 1970s. Then elaboration of principles to cover other emerging issues, direct TV broadcasting principles, respecting the sovereignty of states, from television broadcasting signals coming into their jurisdictions, remote sensing principles. This is the flavor of intelligence gathering, let's say, finding its way into a principle much later, 1986. Nuclear power source principles, information sharing on nuclear power sources, and a recognition of the usefulness of nuclear power sources. But of course, caution must be maintained on those nuclear power sources in Earth orbit, recognizing their benefit for deep space exploration. And of course, that was coming from, of course, the deorbiting of a satellite with nuclear power source of Canada, the Cosmos. And so those principles came out even 10 years later. Benefits declaration and international cooperation, enshrining that international cooperation would be voluntary and on terms of those cooperating states. 1996 leads the way, of course, for states to determine for themselves as sovereign states how they will engage in international cooperation and for what purposes. Then resolutions stemming from the practice of states, recognition of geostationary orbit as a limited resource, and the ITU's work in managing those frequencies and preventing harmful interference. Launching state resolution, of course, on elaborating the concept of the launching state for purposes of both registration and liability. The registration resolution as well came through to recognize the various differences in the ways that states were registering satellites and to try to find a way to consolidate that type of information. And of course, national legislation for promoting space activities. The authorization and continuing supervision comes into play in all the way into 2013. So this is this progressive development of space law, all stemming from issues identified at the very dawn of the space age, and then elaborated through the work of the legal subcommittee and the scientific and technical subcommittee as well for that input that is so necessary for understanding both the development of space activities and then legal issues that come from those. So then where have we gone now? There have been other non-binding approaches, the space debris mitigation guidelines of the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, 2007. And we will hear more about how these space debris mitigation guidelines have been implemented in states and in their regulatory systems, and whether potentially those mitigation guidelines, although not binding at the international level, nevertheless could potentially give evidence of a standard of care when it comes to orbital activities. Then, of course, the seminal guidelines for long-term sustainability of outer space activities of 2019. Really, I would say the treaty of our times. Took 10 years to negotiate, covers so many different areas. All those beginning at the very dawn of the space age are embodied in the long-term sustainability of our space activities, as well as this modern development. And so where do we head with our current and future space activities under the Outer Space Treaty? What approaches are possible to meet the needs of states and the private sector? What we have seen recently over these last number of years is a huge increase of space activities, orbital congestion, as they call it, and lots of orbital space objects are at play. And so the question is, how do we understand the beginnings of potential space traffic management and coordination? How do we deal with potentially intentional or even unintentional creation of more space debris, collisions, collision and coordination, collision avoidance? How do we go about handling these things as an international community, and what is available possibly to states? And then, of course, beyond exploration of our solar system, how do we understand the moon and other celestial bodies and priority rights and space resources, understanding the place of the Moon Agreement in all of these in all of this modern discussion? What do we do about lunar and celestial body coordination? And how do we ensure that information is shared so that all states are taken into account and that they are brought into the fold, let's say, and having the benefits that is so promised under the Outer Space Treaty? And so with that, I would like to say that welcome to the conference on space law and policy for this year, focusing on the Outer Space Treaty. This is the background of where we got to the terms of the Outer Space Treaty. It is instructive because it leads us to an understanding of where we might be going. And This is a great time to be faced with more space activities. Our technological development, we're looking forward at a very fast pace to exploration of the moon. We will see exploration of other celestial bodies, the question of the space resources. How do we sustain these exploration, these scientific missions? How do we benefit from those? How do we share those benefits? And so it's a great time to consider all of these technological advancements and the legal implications that come therefrom, and how they fit within the Outer Space Treaty that has been with us this entire time, that has guided us in this development of space law. It was considered at the very early stages that there would be elaboration in all of these different areas. And for many years, it seemed very quiet. But now I think we are seeing a resurgence of the desire to elaborate more, to come with new and interesting ways of cooperating internationally so that all of these activities can be taken into account. And so with that, I would like to thank you again for allowing me these few words of introduction in a way, this overview of the Outer Space Treaty, how we got here, and where we might be going. I really want to thank you again. And I see that we can probably go ahead and, is considering this, we go ahead and move into the our next presenter, Professor Bittencourt Neto in Brazil, is going to talk to us a bit about this beginning in space law, Article 1, and the benefit and the interests of all countries. Professor, thank you so much. Do you want me to try to share my slides from your slides from my side?
Yes, Mike, I believe it would be easier if you could.
Okay, let's see if I can do this with my technical challenges,
Let
but
me
I'll
know
try.
if it works.
Okay, yes, we'll find out very soon. Thank you so much. Please, sir, let me see here if we can do this. Okay. I believe you maybe you can see them and you can let me know.
Yeah, for sure. I can see it. I believe
Okay, let me
everything
see
is
if I can get a full screen version. Just one moment, please.
sorry for giving you more trouble, Michael.
No, no, it's my pleasure. Let's see. Do we have? My goodness. Here we go. Sir, please, you have the floor. Thank you so much again.
No, thank you so much, dear Michael. Thank you to all the colleagues from UNOOSA. I really would like to thank the organizers for the kind invitation to participate in this year's United Nations Conference on Space Law and Policy. Please accept my sincere gratitude and really thrilled to be here with each one of you today. And I would also like to greet my fellow speakers for today, Andre Mistal, Gabriel Sweeney, Terry Brizibe, and Stephen Freeland. During the past few years, I've had the opportunity of working with you in so many different interesting projects. I truly admire each one of you, and it's an honor and privilege to be here sharing the stage with you virtually this time. So, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning from Brazil. Very early morning down here. This great international conference will offer us the opportunity of reviewing the fundamental principles provided by the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which is usually regarded as the Magna Carta of space law. And our dear Michael explained in detail about it and the evolution of the discussions that led to the agreement that we now consider one of the most important cornerstones of space law and policy. And the Outer Space Treaty principles provide the fundamental structure of the international legal framework applicable to the exploration and use of outer space. And those standards of appropriate behavior have been expanded by other international instruments and later even internalized by several states through domestic legislations. It's important to revisit those principles as we address important questions involving the exploration and use of outer space in the 21st century. This is why this capacity building event is so relevant nowadays. And once again, I'd like to congratulate UNOOSA for organizing it. I feel humbled for the opportunity to be here and be part of this fantastic group of experts, which were carefully selected to share their knowledge, experience, and perspectives with all of us in relation to important provisions of the Outer Space Treaty. It will definitely be a fantastic conference, and I'm looking forward to it. I personally received the great responsibility of addressing the principle of space exploration for the benefit and interest of all countries, as contemplated by Article 1, Paragraph 1st of the Outer Space Treaty. Certainly, it is a key provision of the document and one that has vast repercussions. Indeed, such an important principle deserves to be revisited nowadays when space activities are regarded as essential tools for the economic, social, and political development of every nation on Earth. During the next few minutes, I will present you an overview of such article, including information about its drafting, legal content, interpretation, and application. And afterwards, I'll be glad to answer your questions and to hear your opinions. Okay? So without further ado, let's start. I know our time is limited. Let's start with the first slide. Thanks, Michael, for putting it on screen. So let's first review what the Outer Space Treaty provides regarding exploration and utilization of outer space for the benefit of all countries. At the first paragraph of its introductory article, the treaty solemnly states that the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all countries, irrespective of their degree of economic or scientific development, and shall be the province of all mankind. This is quite important. So it's really wide in its scope and comprehensive in its repercussions. So this principle that has been enshrined by the Outer Space Treaty supports the space exploration for the benefit of all countries. And that's why it deserves to be revisited, because we must address its motivation, the legal content, and also global repercussions. In order to do this, one should favor a systematic approach in order to properly assess the relevance of this provision to the treaty as a whole. So we cannot only tackle this treaty, this provision isolated. We must consider the relationship between this provision and others in the treaty. The principle of exploration and use of outer space for the benefit of all countries must be considered alongside the principles of freedom of access, non-appropriation of outer space, and due regard for the corresponding interests of all states. Of course, those principles will be later addressed by my colleagues. Next slide, please, Michael. Thanks. So now, considering the drafting of this particular provision, it's always important to study it to understand the motivations that led the delegations to accept this wording. In its essence, Article 1, Paragraph 1st of the Outer Space Treaty reflects the first principle of the 1963 Declaration of Legal Principles governing the activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space. And that first article reads as follows, and I quote, "The exploration and use of outer space shall be carried on for the benefit and in the interest of all mankind." At multiple sessions at the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, the UNOOSA, many views were presented by delegates regarding the provision's content and also proper positioning in the Outer Space Treaty structure. The final wording, which were recorded by the delegates, makes it clear that the exploration and use of outer space shall take into account global benefits and repercussions. Therefore, the exploration and use of outer space must be perceived as constructively beneficial to everyone, acknowledging different perspectives. Accordingly, all nations, whether capable or not of developing autonomous space activities, are entitled to participate in the space age. This is a really key provision for every developing state. Nations of what we now recognize as the Global South played an important part during the drafting of the Outer Space Treaty as a whole. And working together, they were able to present their considerations and also have their voices heard. And this is a moment that I would like to recall that the Brazilian delegation, in particular, supported that such provision should be included in the operative part of the treaty and received overwhelming support from other developing nations on that regard. Now, please, the next slide, Michael, if you may. Thanks. Now, considering the legal content of Article 1. Here we have a significant legal content. Why is that? Because, first of all, there seems to be no valid reason why the text of Article 1 should not be regarded as stating a binding legal obligation. And it acknowledges and anticipates the global impact of space activities around the globe, while takes into consideration the desires and demands of all countries on that regard. We must never lose track of the moment when the Outer Space Treaty was drafted back in the late 1960s. By contemplating the concerns of non-spacefaring nations, it was such an inclusive provision and quite relevant back then to developing nations as a whole, because that was a time when space activities were basically reserved to the major global powers. But arguably, the most important legal implication of the provision is that it codified the public interest in outer space. Consequently, the perspectives of all states, North and South, East and West, large and small, they all shall be taken into account as far as the exploration and use of outer space are concerned. So the common good served as a North Star for the international delegates while drafting the Outer Space Treaty, considering the vast strategic implications related to space activities in general. So the article reaches beyond the states parties to the treaties, and this is quite important. Nowadays, it's fully realized that by conjugating international recognition and practice, the provision has arguably attained the status of international custom, applicable erga omnes to every nation on Earth, even to states that are not parties to the Outer Space Treaty. So this is quite an important provision in the whole framework of space law. Next slide, please. Now, please, let's consider the practice in relation to the application of Article 1, Paragraph 1st of the Outer Space Treaty. Here some remarks are certainly of order. First of all, the principle in question has not remained restricted to the Outer Space Treaty itself. One should remember that subsequent international instruments, either bilateral or multilateral, have contemplated that the exploration and use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all countries. Nations of the Global South have led international debates promoting the use of space toward economic and social advancements in so many different forums, so many different instances. And here it's important to make reference to the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 51-122 of 1996, which is titled Declaration on International Cooperation in the Exploration in the Use of Outer Space for the Benefit and in the Interest of All States, taking into particular account the needs of developing countries. So it's such an important resolution. In one way or another, it was able to apply the Article 1 principle of the Outer Space Treaty, considering the demands from developing nations. First of all, the resolution urges particular attention to the perspectives of those nations, considering their needs and demands. Moreover, the document supports international cooperation on an equitable and mutually acceptable basis. So it promotes international cooperation, and of course, international cooperation can be done in so many different instances and involving so many different actions. And but it's quite important for each developing nation in order to gain access to certain strategic uses of outer space. And finally, it promotes the exchange of expertise and technology among states. And one way or another, even this event, this fantastic event that has been organized by UNOOSA, serves as also to promote that proposal, specifically as a capacity building mechanism that's beneficial to each and every nation on Earth. But now we're going to dive into the trickier part of this provision, and it's involving the interpretation. Next slide, please, Michael. Thanks, and sorry for giving you so much trouble again, but it's moving so smoothly, I couldn't ask for more. Thanks a lot. Now, it's going to get a little bit trickier. Because first of all, you must always realize that, and you all know, that treaties don't operate in a vacuum. So it's important to consider the interpretation of Article 1. And in one way or another, they're going to reflect the views, the concerns, and the fears of each and every nation in relation to the peaceful exploration and use of outer space. As we just mentioned, the Outer Space Treaty is somehow a child of the Cold War. It was enacted in a particular historical moment of the Cold War, more than half a century ago. And of course, the delegations that negotiated the treaty could not possibly anticipate all the current concerns of the international community. A lot of very important issues that we are having to deal with nowadays, they could not possibly be anticipated by delegations back in the 1960s, as everything that we have been working on, for instance, in relation to the long-term sustainability of outer space. And of course, in general, treaties face challenges when dealing with the time factor, especially when its subject matter experiences dramatic evolutions, as has happened to space activities in general. So the use and implementation of treaties and treaty provisions, they're going to reflect the concerns and the fears of the international community as a whole. And as time goes by, interpretation of even core treaty provisions cannot, and in fact should not, be avoided. That's why we're seeing more and more reinterpretation of the fundamental principles of the Outer Space Treaty. Sometimes conflicting interpretation of certain aspects and articles. Based on the topic that's under my responsibility today, it's important to consider the different interpretations regarding certain passage of Article 1, Paragraph 1st of the Outer Space Treaty, the passage that stipulates that the exploration and use of outer space shall be the province of all mankind. The concept of province of mankind, or humankind for that matter, has led to international debates among so many scholars and delegates, and sometimes very heated debates. And one must realize that the Outer Space Treaty by itself does not define the provision, nor clarify its normative application throughout the subsequent articles of the treaty. So, and it's really complicated because interpretation of treaties may be more an art than a science. But the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties of 1969 has a whole section in its part 3 devoted to codifying the primary rules of interpretation of treaties. And its Article 31, the Vienna Convention produces a sensible compromise between the textual and teleological approaches, stipulating that treaties shall be interpreted in accordance with the ordinary meaning to be given to the words in their context and in light with the treaty's object and purpose. And of course, Article 31 surely is going to be mentioned by my colleagues during the rest of this important event. Different interpretations of the term province have been observed in so many instances, either relating it to a certain real or domain, territorially speaking, or to an expected set of conducts. So, nevertheless, it seems clear that the set provision establishes a link between the exploration and use of outer space on one hand and the related benefits to all countries. Reference to humankind in Article 1 also serves to clarify the ample scope of repercussions of space activities to everyone, which was anticipated by the delegates back then, irrespective of their nationality or country of residence. Additionally, we may even observe that Article 1, Paragraph 1 has also served as the threshold for different regulatory efforts regarding the long-term sustainability of outer space, as, for instance, the 2019 UN Corpus Guidelines. But that is not the only topic of contention when we address different interpretations of Article 1. Please, Michael, the next slide. So, given the evolving nature of space activities, the general legal status of outer space has led to intensive debates, and Article 1 plays a relevant part on it. When reviewed in conjunction with the remaining treaty, Article 1 may be construed as classifying outer space as a case of global commons. Such conclusion emerges from the understanding that the outer space constitutes a resource domain to which all nations have access, but to which none has the right to claim sovereignty. Therefore, the use and exploration of outer space requires international cooperation so as to assure due regard for the corresponding interests of all nations. And of course, this is really complicated because international cooperation is not simple, specifically when we address strategic uses of outer space. And we also must remember that in space law, as in space policy in general, words matter. By legally classifying outer space as a case of global commons, relevant political consequences naturally ensue. Specifically, that space activities shall acknowledge shared and correlated interests of all stakeholders. And governing global commons in a coordinated, peaceful, and prosperous manner is always a great challenge. Difficulties are related to the interconnectivity and complexity of global commons, not only in terms of resources located therein, but also regarding the diversity of actors who use those resources while interacting with each other. It's no surprise, therefore, that some have voiced really strong concerns about considering outer space as a case of global commons, and those opinions should not be taken for granted. Please, Michael, the final slide. And I believe I'm following the time structure that you proposed us. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, please allow me just to mention and conclude my brief presentation with some general remarks. First of all, the rapid growth of space activities, the diversification of space sectors, and a booming space economy have opened opportunities while raising new challenges to the peaceful exploration and use of outer space. And outer space is seen nowadays as a strategic asset by different space stakeholders. Our contemporary world relies upon and is enabled by a complex space infrastructure. But in our dynamic international environment, priorities may collide, as they often do. Therefore, we must build trust and channels of communication between different space actors. Additionally, I consider important to acknowledge the fact that access to outer space is still not universal. Strategic space activities remain out of reach to many nations of the global south, which must rely on international cooperation to secure access to the benefits of space activities. And it is exactly for that reason that the principle enshrined by Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, providing that space exploration shall be pursued for the benefit and in the interest of all countries, is more relevant now than ever. Irrespective of geopolitical considerations and substantive inequalities, a common interest and a shared fate await humankind as we advance through the cosmos, and all nations have a stake on this. That is why global governance is so strategic to promote sustainable and secure space activities. To conclude, I believe that an inclusive attitude is required, considering different perspectives for the benefit of all. Thank you once again for this opportunity, and of course, I'll be glad to answer your questions. Thank you, Michael, for your assistance. It's been really helpful.
Michael, microphone.
Your microphone, Michael.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much again, Professor. I really appreciate your contribution, your words on this. Just 1 second while I look at the chat. Maybe you could just elaborate a little bit more. Would you see the opportunities for cooperation in developing more and the understanding of the benefits of outer space and how those could be more effectively shared as we look to all of those future activities that we're looking at? Maybe you can share a couple of words while I look at the chat for any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Know, it's really important to consider the importance of international collaboration and cooperation in relation to so many different topics of the day, not only in relation to the long-term sustainability of outer space, but in relation, for instance, to lunar activities or space traffic management, space security. It's important to somehow find ways to uh, close those gaps, and most importantly, to build bridges among nations in relation to several different topics. And of course, we're living in a difficult moment internationally, and so many issues are capable of dividing delegations, dividing nations, and not only among itself, but inside it themselves. So this is really a complicated moment, and there's a lot of conflict in relation to certain topics of space law and policy and space activities in general. But conflict is not a bad thing by itself. You know, and I'm not saying wars, I'm saying conflicts, differences of opinion. Conflicts are part of life. And this is exactly by dealing with conflicts, we can have a more inclusive approach, accepting and understanding different perspectives and demands from different stakeholders. The problem are not the conflicts by themselves, it's how we're going to deal with those conflicts. Are we going to deal with it constructively, trying to find solutions, common solutions to follow, common concerns, or are we going to deal with them destructively and in one way or another putting in jeopardy everything that we've built in relation to space law and policy for the past decades? So I believe that we won't be able to find effective solutions to the current issues involved in space activities without strong collaboration. And of course, this is hard. It ain't gonna be easy, but it's gonna require a commitment by every stakeholder in order to find a way to establish a better communication and exchange of information in order to understand the different perspectives. And of course, it's going to be important to welcome everyone to the table to share their views.
Thank you so much, Professor. Yeah, that is absolutely going to be essential for sharing views between all of these actors in space activities, and really opening the door for all of those that can come into play. We have a question here that comes, can you explain what you mean by the concept of common good? This is something we hear a lot about, but is lacking clear legal content. Is it a political term that's applied to space law? Maybe you can elaborate a bit on that. The notion of the concept of the common good. What does that actually mean?
No, that's really interesting. Thank you for your question. And of course, as in relation to several other provisions of the Outer Space Treaty, some words that have been used, they have a really interesting undertone, especially the political repercussions that they raise, but they are not clearly legally defined. And that's what open possibility of different interpretations. And when we're talking about the common good, we're trying to portray the, let's say, the perspective of different delegations in relation to the enactment of the Outer Space Treaty. That first of all, the outer space by itself cannot be appropriated by any nation. in one way or another, by considering the outer space as the province of all humankind, there is a clear connection between demands from different nations and the benefits that may accrue from space exploration and use. But what you mentioned is really interesting, because clearly when we mention the wording common good, this is not only a legal concept, it's also a political statement, and of course with moral undertones, and it must be interpreted in that way. Because when we address the possibility of understanding space activities as having multiple impacts and affecting everyone around the globe, this is not only a legal concept, it is also a political statement. And there are several provisions of the Outer Space Treaty that goes in and venture to that direction. And of course, I could be speaking about it for hours. I don't want to invade the time slotted for my colleagues, but I would like just to mention this. When we're talking about the common good in relation to the exploration and use of outer space, we are considering basically that the exploration and use of outer space is going to provide benefits that must be understood as relevant to each and every nation around the globe. So how we do this is important. And international cooperation coordination is quite relevant for space activities.
I really appreciate it, you sharing your views on this, and it's incredibly important that we keep these aspects in mind. This is the basis of international cooperation to ensure that we achieve the common good and through these space activities, that these benefits, that space activities remain, in the interests and for the benefit of all countries, just like the Outer Space Treaty says. This was, as I was relating at the very beginning, this was a consideration that was seen as really a basic principle that would allow space activities to be considered, along with their being for peaceful purposes, that they work to benefit all of humankind. This aspect has carried forward since the very dawn of the space age, and through the proposals of the Soviet Union at the time, and through the agreement by consensus on the Declaration of the Legal Principles and on the proposed treaty that has now become the treaty, which was, like I was saying, it took such a rapid pace in development in those early years, that this really was at the core of it, was this benefits for all, this method and mode of international cooperation. And with that, I'd really like to thank you again for sharing your views. Brazil has always been a proponent of this particular aspect and topic, and even in these latest days of the debate on the space resources and the development of the working group on space resources, Brazil was conscious to include into the mandate that this would be that there would be aspects related to understanding how to share the benefits derived from outer space, whether those be informational, scientific, and technological, as well as how and understanding how the commercial exploitation would eventually play out. And with that, I would like to thank you again for sharing your views. And speaking of the working group on space resources, I note that we have our distinguished former chair of the legal subcommittee, our current chair of the working group on space resources, our illustrious Ambassador Andrei Mishtal. And please, sir, if I can give you the floor to talk about